Swarming is female reproduction for honeybees. A colony divides into two parts. Half of the part, the workers, stay at the maternal nest site and support a new sister that will emerge in that natal nest, who will then become the queen. The other half leave, they fly away from the nest, and they support the mother queen who goes with her. So this diagram shows we start with a colony. We divide in half, not the combs, but the workers divide in half. Then they form a swarm. And you can see the swarm hanging there in the tree. The swarm is the intermediary state to dividing and going to a new nest. After the bees settle on this new site, they then start seeking new nest sites. And when they find one, then they leave this temporary site where they're swarmed, and they go into their newfound nest. This newfound nest is typically inside of some kind of a hollow container. It could be the inside of a hollow tree, or it could be a barrel that you have out in your backyard. But they'll go inside of a confined space, an enclosed space, and they will establish the new nest for the colony that contains half the workers and the old mother queen. In the other half, the half that remains after the swarm leaves, a new queen will emerge inside of that nest and will then inherit all of the combs, the workers, and everything that was left behind. In order to swarm, they have to produce new queens because this is a matter of reproduction. The reproductive units are derived from fission, a large number of workers, and an old queen leaves, and behind you have the combs and a large number of workers, and the new queen that comes into the colony and inherits it. So they have to raise queens. Queens are raised under three different kinds of conditions. There's the swarm, where they're preparing for colony fission and female reproduction. There's also the emergency condition. That's where the queen dies unexpectedly and accidentally. Just all of a sudden she disappears. And so under the emergency queen condition, the workers select specific larvae that were destined initially to become worker larvae, worker adults, and they change those cells and convert those worker cells into the queen type cells, like you see on the left. At the bottom, those are swarm cells. The queens are produced in peanut-shaped cells that are large, and they hang upside down. So they'll take the worker cells, which are normally horizontal to the bottom of the nest, and they'll extend them out, turn them down, and turn them into a queen cell. And typically they'll do 10 or 12 queen cells, emergency queen cells, in order to rescue the colony from dying. If they don't have a queen, all the workers will get old, they'll die, and the whole colony dies. Another condition under which they produce queens is called supersedure. Notice that this is supersedure with an S, not a C. So a lot of people misspell it. They think it's supersedure like this document supersedes the previous document, but it's not. It's a very special word that is specifically for this particular act in honeybees. When they supersede their old queen, they're replacing her. They're replacing her with one of her daughters, which is also one of their sisters. And this is a process that is organized. It's deliberate in the sense that it's not an emergency condition. The queen actually laid an egg inside of that cell that you see there, the one queen cell. She laid an egg in it herself, and it developed. And the queen that emerges from this will replace her mother, the old queen. This happens when queens start to fail. Queens don't live forever, and it's much more orderly if you can replace yourself before you die and create an emergency situation where you're producing these kinds of cells. And to do it early enough in the season so the colony can continue to build up and survive. Typically, when bees swarm, they'll produce up to about 20 swarm cells, queen cells. As I said before, it might be 10 or 12 of these emergency cells, and typically just 1 or 2 of the supersedure cells. But it's all a process whereby they can replace a queen under 3 different kinds of stimulus conditions. Queens inhibit queen cell construction. So to get new queens produced so that you can swarm, or to get a supersedure queen produced, the inhibition that the queen holds over the queen cell construction in the nest has to be overcome. The inhibition of queen cell construction is a consequence of compounds called pheromones, chemicals that are produced in primarily the mandibular glands, the tergal glands, which are glands on the back of the bee between the sclerites. Those are those hard armored plates that they have on the back, and produced with tarsal glands, which are in their feet. So the queen produces large amounts of mandibular gland pheromone. It's also known as the queen substance. And she distributes that to workers that form an entourage around her constantly. They're constantly grooming her, they're feeding her, and then they're taking back the mandibular gland secretion from her. And then they feed it to their neighbors, and they feed it to their neighbors. And these secretions spread throughout the entire nest. And so they're always out there, and they're inhibiting the bees from raising new queens and from constructing queen cells. The tarsal glands on their feet, as they walk on the comb, they're depositing this. And then the bees come into contact with it that are being deposited on the comb, and then that inhibits them from raising queen cells. And the tergal glands, the pheromone just is secreted by them and just spreads over the cuticular surface of the queen. She has this hard, it's called chitinous material over her body. It's a complex polysaccharide. And that's coated with a waxy substance that she secretes from glands that are on the surface of her body. These tergal gland secretions then spread themselves across the top of the body through this layer of lipids that she has, or hydrocarbons that she has on her body surface. So she's walking around the nest, feeding bees this inhibiting secretion, which they feed to others and feed to others, which soon every individual in the nest has come into contact with it, because the bees, one of their primary things you can observe them doing in an observation hive is feeding each other. It's called trophallaxis, and they feed each other constantly. So they get distributed by feeding. Bees walk around, they engage in the tergal gland substances that are being placed on the comb as she walks, and the tarsal gland and the tergal glands, as they groom her and lick her, they get those off of her body into their bodies, and then they distribute it. Certain conditions encourage queen rearing. It encourages the bees to construct queen cells and raise queens. First of all is the absence or decline of these queen pheromones, the pheromones that are inhibiting it. So if you have a decline or an absence of the inhibitor, then the bees start constructing cells. It's like constructing the cells is the default condition. They will do it if they aren't being inhibited by the pheromones that are produced by the queen. So the queen can actually reduce the amount of pheromone that she produces, which would produce a decline in the amount of pheromone, or the distribution of the pheromones could be reduced. So, for instance, if the queen produced the same amount of pheromone, but you had a lot more bees for it to be distributed to, each bee would get less. And so each bee would be relatively less inhibited than they were when there were fewer bees with the same amount of pheromone being distributed in the colony. Crowded conditions. Crowded conditions affect or encourage queen rearing in two ways. Again, if it's really crowded, the pheromones that the queen produces get diluted as they get spread to more and more and more individuals. And also, just the crowding itself serves as a stimulus. When the brood nest, the center of the nest of the bee, where the queen lays her eggs and the larvae are fed and they mature to adults, when that gets real crowded, the bees are bumping into each other, and that's another stimulus for raising queens. And time of year. It's a seasonal activity. It doesn't happen all the time. It's happening on a seasonal basis. This figure here shows a study that I did when I was a graduate student at University of California, Davis. I worked out at the bee lab, and the bee lab for many, many years had been accepting phone calls from people who had swarms. They may have a swarm in their tree or a bush or something in Davis, and they would call up the bee lab, and the bee lab would send somebody out who would collect it because they wanted the bees, and they were easy to get, collecting the swarms, bring them back, put them in hives, those boxes, and then they would have a new colony and a new hive of bees. But over time, there was really no interest in continuing to collect those swarms, but people still phoned in. They phoned in to the lab, and people would answer the phone, and then beekeepers would tell the people at the lab, oh, gee, if you get any swarm calls, let me know, because then I'll go out and I'll collect a swarm. They wanted the swarms, even though we didn't. So we got a lot of calls. The phone calls would come in. And so I answered the phone often. And I thought to myself, I'd like to do a survey. I'm really curious about the seasonal aspect of swarming in Davis, California. And also, fire departments get a lot of phone calls. And they also have a list of beekeepers that they will then call for to go and collect these swarms to help people out. So I let the local fire department know that I was taking a survey, and I wanted to know when they got swarm calls, and then I would follow up and call the people back. And then the phone calls that came into the lab, if I took them, I'd ask them questions. If someone else did, I get their phone numbers. So I collected all these calls, and then I verified them individually to make sure, because sometimes people will call up and say, oh, I got a swarm of bees on the eave of my house, and it's just a little paper wasp nest. So I would verify each and every one of them. So over the course of one season, this would be the spring and summer, and up to the beginning of autumn, I got 121 calls that I verified. And this shows the distribution of those swarms in the frequency of them occurring. And as you can see, there's very, very distinct production time for swarms in California that extends pretty much April and in May. And this is it's a 5 or 6 week window where there's a really intense number of swarms that issue from these colonies. If you look at the events that lead up to swarming, colonies, it's the right time of the year. It's in the spring. This is the right time to be swarming. And certain things are taking place. First of all, you have the emergence of young bees. The colony went through the winter. It didn't raise very many larvae into bees. The population declined because the older bees were dying off during the winter, and they weren't producing enough young bees to replace them. But then when you get into the beginning of spring, there's flowers, there's pollen. Pollen is the protein source for raising new bees, the larvae. The pollen's coming in. It's a good time of the year. The queen then starts laying more eggs. The worker bees prepare the cells that she lays her eggs in for the worker to make new worker bees. And so she's laying eggs in these cells. They're maturing, they're emerging. And so you have this increase in the number of new bees that comes in. It's an exponential increase during that time of the season in the spring. So you're getting more and more and more young bees are emerging in the comb, and they're overwhelming the brood nest. So you end up with what I call too many unemployed workers. They come out in the center of the nest because that's where the larvae are reared. They emerge and they're just hanging around. They're not progressing through the different things that they normally do with respect to their division of labor and then initiating foraging. They're just kind of hanging around because there's too many of them. This results in a decline in the distribution of the queen pheromones. So the queen's still producing her pheromones, but there's a lot more bees that have to be serviced, and a lot of those are the young bees in the middle that are unemployed. So then queen rearing gets initiated. There's less inhibition of queen rearing because of the distribution of the queen pheromones. And so they start raising cells. And because it's swarm season, they will raise up to 20 or so cells. You saw the pictures of those a couple of slides ago. So they start producing queen cells. Then as those queen cells mature, it takes 16 days from the time the egg is laid in a queen cup till the adult is ready to emerge as a new queen, an adult queen, from that queen cell. So that's 21 days. So they start raising queens, and so then they're getting prepared to swarm. The queen is then placed on a diet because she can only eat what's being fed to her, this very nutritious, high in protein, high in energy royal jelly that she gets fed. The workers start feeding her less and being fed less, then she's kind of on a diet. And she lays a lot of eggs. She lays one egg a minute, 24 hours a day. So if she's not getting enough food in and she's laying eggs, she starts shrinking very quickly. Within very few days, she loses 25% of her body weight, and so that she can slim down and be able to fly. When she's actively laying eggs, she can't fly. Her abdomen is too big. It's fat. It's full of eggs. So she shrinks down, goes on a diet, and then she's svelte and ready to fly. This time, the scouts start looking for a new nest. Scout bees are worker bees who were previously foragers. And during the time of swarming and finding a new nest, they take on the job of finding new places to go. So they start scouting out around the where the nest is located, start looking for new nest sites. But they also locate someplace that the swarm can sit at an intermediate stage after it leaves the nest. The bees then start becoming agitated. The colony, we call it nervous. The bees act nervous. They're kind of buzzing around. Then the scouts start running through the nest, vibrating their wings and making buzzing sounds, these buzzing runs. That really gets the other workers all excited and agitated. It gets them ready to go. Then when this starts going on, then workers start pushing the mother queen towards the entrance of the nest. They're pushing her, they're pulling on her, they're tugging at her. They get her near the entrance, and then something happens, and the bees all take out. About half of the bees will take flight with the queen, and she takes flight. So now they're in the air, and so they got to go somewhere, and you've got maybe 25,000 bees swarming around in the air. They need to get someplace. So if you look at the organization of this swarm, it's swirling around for the most part, just kind of swirling and looks very disorganized. It typically will occupy a volume that's about 3 meters high and about 10 meters wide. So it's a big space that they're flying around. Many of you have probably seen swarms in the air at some point in time. But the scout bees, the ones who actually know where this thing is going, are flying quickly through the swarm in straight lines. They're called streakers. At least this is a hypothesis of how they guide the swarm. And they're responsible to guide the swarm towards this initially intermediate site where they're going to cluster together and form that swarm that you see. So the swarm will land on a branch or another substrate close to the nest. It's generally within 100 or 200 meters from the nest where they make this first intermediate settling site. The first bees to land on this branch or whatever they're going to cluster on will start doing what we call scent fanning. They will expose at the end of their abdomen a gland, and it's called the Nasonov gland, and it's between the last two segments, between the second to the last and the next to the last, and it's like a little sponge in there. It's a very soft material and fleshy, and it produces the Nasonov secretion, which smells like geraniol. Well, it is geraniol. It smells like citrus. And they fan their wings. And so by fanning their wings, they're blowing this pheromone backwards from their body, and it wafts through the air. And this pheromone is known as an orientation pheromone. And it causes the other bees to orient to it. So when they start getting the wafting of this geraniol, they start orienting towards that source of it, and then they will go over and they'll land near where this bee is, who's doing the maybe the first bee that landed. And then they'll start scent fanning. They'll expose their gland, and they'll scent. And pretty soon you have a large number of bees that are sending out this signal, this orientation pheromone, that basically tells all these other bees out here, come over here, this is where we're clustering. And so the bees come and they settle, and pretty soon you have a cluster that looks like this. They're all sitting here on this branch. They oriented to it. After this thing settles, scouts begin their job again. Up to 500 former foragers will become scouts, and they fly out from the swarm. They're searching for a new home. They will scour an area of about 70 square kilometers, looking for suitable new nesting sites. And each one, when it finds something, will come back and perform a recruitment dance on the surface of the swarm, on the outside of it. This dance will indicate direction and distance to the place that they think is a good place to have a new home. And so you have these 500 former foragers out there searching around. And so at the beginning, you'll see dances on the surface of the comb that indicate directions and distances that are very different from each other. But then there's a process by which they come to a consensus location. You know, they will attend each other's dances, maybe fly out and look at another nest site and then come back, and then they'll either dance for that one or their old one. But after a while, this all settles out, and it's amazing. It can take place in a couple of hours, or sometimes it takes days for them to actually come to some sort of a consensus location. Once they find it, then the swarm dissolves from the wherever it is currently, and it flies off and it occupies its new nest site that was discovered and assessed by the scout bees. There are certain design principles to make a nest site optimal for bees. In the first place, it must be defensible. It has to be something where they can defend. A nest, a honeybee nest, is full of rich resources. It's full of sugar and honey. I mean, that so many bears like it, ants like it, we like it. Also, the larvae, the brood that are being raised in the nest are great sources of protein, and even some human societies eat the brood as a source of protein, as well as bears and other animals. Also, the other resource is the wax. The wax has to be defended because it's also an important resource. Some other insects eat wax, and other honeybees will raid a colony if they find it and try to steal its honey. So it has to be defensible. It also has to be sufficiently insulated for them to control the temperature. The bees that we maintain for commercial beekeeping and all in the United States and most parts of the world are actually evolved in the northern hemisphere. They evolved primarily in Europe. And these bees experience cold winters. So bees survive in Wisconsin, and they survive in areas of Canada. They live inside of their nest structures, a tree, hollow tree, or whatever. And so they have to be able to insulate and keep themselves from freezing. They thermoregulate. They generate heat inside of this nest that keeps it from freezing and the individuals in it from freezing. Also, it has to accommodate the structure of the nest. You know, the nest is composed of parallel vertical combs. They have to be large enough for them to store honey, store pollen, raise brood. So it has to be able to accommodate that. So optimal nest characteristics, when a study that was done back in the 70s, showed that the optimal size volume is about 40 to 45 liters. That's the optimal size for a nest. And the bees can actually measure, the scout bees can actually measure the volume of the potential nest. They do this by walking it off and pacing it in different directions. And somehow or another, they do some calculus and they come up with ways of comparing, at any rate, what's good or better or not good enough. Then they have to have sufficient integrity not to be leaky. Often these are inside of hollowed out trees. And these trees are hollowed out because they have fungus and stuff that's eaten the insides of them out. So it has to have enough integrity that it's not going to just fall apart. It has to not have too many cracks in it. They can seal up small cracks. They have a mechanism for doing that. They collect plant resins and they use it like glue or like spackle, and they close up these leaks and whatnot. But it has to be not too damp inside. It has to be not too leaky to the air outside. Typically, I won't say typically, but their preference is for south-facing entrance. So it's a cavity that has an opening that faces to the south. To the south, because these evolved in the northern hemisphere. And in the northern hemisphere, during the winter time, the sun is more to the south. And so the heat of the sun will be on the south part of the whatever the structure is that they're nesting in, let's say a tree, and will heat that part of the tree up and also heat the entrance up, which they're going to be defending. And it's typically at the bottom of the nest. At the bottom of the nest because they generate heat. And the heat that they generate rises up inside of this space that they're nested in. So it rises up. And then the cold air settles back down. So putting the entrance at the bottom, the cold air flows out and the warm air flows up. And the entrance is typically between 12.5 and 75 square centimeters in size. You don't want it too big because it's hard to defend it, and it's also hard to keep the cold air out. And you don't want it too small because you also have to ventilate. In the summer, it gets warm, so it has to be big enough that you can ventilate and get heat out of it. And the entrance is high up. High enough up that it's not going to be encountered by a lot of potential predators that would be disturbing it. Like, for instance, skunks. Skunks love to scratch at the entrance of honeybee nests. And then when the bees fly out, the skunks eat the bees. They eat the workers that come out to defend because they're apparently unimpeded by the stinging. And every one of those little bees has a little bit of honey in them, and it makes a sweet treat. The new nest has to get constructed fast. I mean, they just moved in, they moved out, they left all the combs and everything behind. They moved into a new nest. So maybe there's 25,000 bees to begin with. And in the swarm when it then occupies this new nest. But these bees are not young. I mean, they're aging. And every day there's fewer of them as they age. So you got to replace them. They got to get going fast. So if they came in and they started constructing comb immediately, they would only, the first day, only be a few cells. So the queen could only lay a few eggs. And so later on, there's only going to be a few coming out. It takes 21 days for a worker to develop from the egg. So once they come into this new nest site, no new bees will be emerging until at least 21 days later. And of those, there's only going to be a few coming out. There will still be more bees dying every day than there will be new bees emerging every day. That's why this curve here continues to go down. This is worker population. It goes down. At this point here, there's going to be some new adults will start emerging, but not very many. So the population still goes down. And then after a while, there's going to finally be more bees emerging than are dying. And then the population will build back up again. This is the pattern they go through every time. So they have to build fast in order to get cells that the queen can lay in to produce more workers. And that's why about 90% of the nest is constructed in about 45 days. That's a very rapid construction project. The comb itself is engineered for maximum strength and minimum wax. Wax is expensive. So they want every bit of wax to be maximally used for storage of honey and pollen and new brood. 1 kilogram of wax costs energetically about 6 to 9 kilograms of honey to produce. And 1 kilogram of wax makes about 77,000 cells. You can see all the individual cells. So 1 kilogram of wax will make about 77,000. And every kilogram costs 6 to 9 kilograms of honey to produce. So 1 kilogram of wax represents about 990,000 scales. So this wax comes from glands that are on the underside of the abdomen of worker bees. They're paired. They're called wax mirrors. They're glands that are between these plates, the segmented plates that make up insects. They're secreted on these wax mirrors, and they're just little scales. And so the bees hang in festoons like this and like this and eat sugar. And that's all they do. They festoon, they eat sugar, and then they secrete these wax scales from these glands on their abdomen. So it takes about 990,000 of these scales to make 1 kilogram of wax. That's a lot of secreting. It's a lot of bees hanging in festoons doing nothing except eating honey and making wax. The nest typically has about 100,000 cells total. So the whole thing is about 100,000 cells. It took about 1.3 kilograms of wax to make that 100,000 cells. About 1.3 million wax scales that were produced by these bees that are hanging in these festoons. Then from that, they build typically 8 parallel combs inside of this space that they're nesting in, the nest space itself. Typically about 8 parallel combs inside of this roughly 42 liter volume nest. Back at the old home, the one that they left, if you remember, there were maybe 20 queen cells that were produced, and only one of them left. Only the old queen left. After the old queen left, these new queens, these new sisters, emerge in this old nest. And then they work it out. They fight to the death for who actually inherits this really rich resource. I mean, this is an incredible inheritance. It would be like after you're born, your parents decide to move out and they leave the house and the car and the money in the bank and everything to you. It's a really big resource to be getting as an inheritance from the queen mother. So they fight, and also in the process of doing this fighting, additional swarms may come out of this that only have virgin queens in them that aren't, and these are called after swarms. So one or two after swarms may also come out from this nest and fly off, but in the end, there can be only one queen, and that's determined by who was the toughest.